Most organizations think cloud migrations fail because they picked the wrong Azure service, the wrong network model, the wrong SKU. They are wrong. Migrations fail because leadership frames them as an IT project. Move the servers, hit the date, don't disrupt the business. That framing guarantees disruption because the business isn't disrupted by compute. It's disrupted by entropy, identity drift, policy gaps, uncontrolled exceptions, and delivery teams improvising at scale. Today, this gets simple. Platform first, then sequencing, then modernization that compounds. Remember this line. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The foundational misunderstanding, migration as an IT project. The foundational mistake is treating legacy as old hardware. Legacy is not servers in a basement. Legacy is socio-technical debt, brittle software, undocumented dependencies, approvals wired into people, audit evidence stored in tribal memory, and business processes that only work because 3 specific humans know which workaround to run on Tuesday nights. That distinction matters. When leaders say we're moving to Azure, they often mean we're changing where the infrastructure lives. But what the organization is actually doing is changing its operating model, or pretending it can avoid that change. It cannot. Azure doesn't magically make a broken operating model behave. It amplifies it. In the same way a faster conveyor belt doesn't fix a messy factory floor, it spreads the mess faster. If you migrate chaos to the cloud, you don't get agility, you get expensive chaos. And the anti-pattern cluster is painfully consistent. Leadership mandates speed. Move fast, we'll tighten controls later. Delivery teams hear, ship now, governance is optional. Security hears, accept risk until the audit shows up. Finance hears, we'll figure out cost management once we've exited the data center. And the platform team, if it even exists, gets handed a timeline, not authority. So what gets measured? Apps migrated, servers decommissioned, terabytes moved, percent complete. Those are activity metrics. They're comforting. They're also irrelevant to whether the business can operate, because the outcomes that matter are different. How long from idea to production? How stable is production when change happens? How predictable is cost to serve per workload? How many teams can onboard safely without inventing their own cloud? Cloud migrations are justified by outcomes, not architectures. Now here's why the IT project framing keeps producing executive surprise. In an IT project, you assume the environment is stable, the requirements are knowable, and the main risk is technical execution. In an enterprise migration, the environment is not stable. The business keeps changing, the org keeps reorganizing. Compliance expectations evolve, the threat model evolves, vendor contracts shift, and most importantly, every exception you approve today becomes a permanent pathway tomorrow. Exceptions are not one-time decisions, they are entropy generators. This is why "we'll centralize later" is a lie you tell yourself. Not because people are dishonest, because once delivery teams have a working path, they will keep using it. And once the business is dependent on that path, you can't remove it without a fight. The cloud doesn't create this behavior, it exposes it. So when leadership says, just lift and shift first, what they're often doing is buying time. And time is fine if you spend it building the control plane. But most organizations spend that time doing more lifts, more shifts, and more exceptions. Therefore, the lift and shift becomes the destination. And then everyone acts confused when cost goes up, risk goes up, and delivery gets slower. Let's anchor this with a failure story, because slides won't save you. A financial services org, regulated, audit-heavy, and absolutely dependent on clean separation of duties, decided to modernize quickly. Leadership intent was simple: migrate a set of internal finance apps over a quarter, keep the same access model, and clean up governance after the move. What actually happened was predictable. The apps moved, the cutovers succeeded, availability was fine. Then Monday came, access requests exploded because the old approval pathways didn't map cleanly to Azure roles and entra groups. Audit trails became fragmented because logging wasn't centralized, and retention assumptions were different. Teams started creating temporary workarounds, ad hoc role assignments, shared accounts, manual exports of logs, and spreadsheet-based evidence for compliance. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The invisible constraint they ignored was governance throughput. In regulated environments, the rate at which you can safely change access policy, logging, and evidence is slower than the rate at which delivery teams can ship infrastructure. So if you migrate workloads faster than you can enforce intent, you accumulate governance debt faster than you can repay it. That debt doesn't sit quietly. It shows up as blocked work, audit panic, and incident response that can't answer basic questions. The principle that would have prevented it is boring, and that's why people skip it. Establish the landing zone, identity, policy, network, logging, and subscription boundaries before you migrate anything that matters. Because the first workload sets the precedent. The precedent becomes the pattern. The pattern becomes the platform, whether you designed it or not. And this is the uncomfortable truth. If your first migration task is moving workloads, you've already failed. So before we talk about what moves first, we have to define Azure correctly, not as a place, as the control plane that makes intent enforceable at scale. Failure story. the cutover that went fine. They love telling this story because it sounds like competence. A healthcare and life sciences organization planned a weekend cutover for a legacy but stable patient portal and a couple of back-end services. Leadership intent was no downtime, weekend-only disruption, keep the same controls for now, and we'll modernize the governance after we're safely in Azure. In other words, move the workload first, then fix the operating model later. What actually happened is the part nobody puts in the status deck. The cutover itself went fine. Data synced, DNS flipped, endpoints responded, the portal came up on Monday morning, and technically it worked. Then the business tried to operate. Clinicians couldn't access the right records because the identity model was now half on-prem groups, half intra groups with inconsistent mappings. The help desk got flooded with, "It worked on Friday" tickets, and the only answer was to add more people to more groups faster. Researchers lost access to shared datasets because storage permissions had been recreated manually, and the inheritance model wasn't what anyone assumed. Audit asked for evidence of who approved what access changed during the cutover window, and the logs were split across subscriptions with different retention, different workspace locations, and different owners. By noon, you had the usual symptoms: emergency access grants, ad hoc role assignments, shared accounts just for today, and a spreadsheet titled something like Access Fixes Final V7. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. Here's the invisible constraint they ignored. Governance debt accumulates faster than delivery can patch it. When you move a workload, you don't just move compute. You move every surrounding dependency that used to be free because it was implicit. Identity flows, approval flows, logging flows, evidence flows. In regulated environments, those flows are the business. The application is just the user interface on top. And the minute you cut over, the business doesn't ask, "Is the VM running?" The business asks, "Can my people do their jobs? And can I prove they did them under control?" If you don't pre-build the guardrails, teams improvise them. And improvised guardrails don't converge into a clean design. They converge into a pile of exceptions that nobody wants to touch again. That's the physics of it. The preventing principle is not complicated, but it is unpopular. Treat migration as an operating model change and build the guardrails before the first workload earns the right to move. That means landing zone policies exist, management group inheritance exists, subscription boundaries exist, logging is centralized, identity is consistent, and the approval model is real, not planned, real. Because once the business resumes operations, you will not get the quiet time back. Every day after cutover becomes a negotiation between delivery speed and control loses when it isn't enforced by design. So the cutover went fine, the business week didn't. And that's why the next step is defining Azure correctly. Before you define a migration plan, Azure isn't a destination you arrive at. It's a control plane you either establish or you don't. Azure is not the destination, it's the control plane. Most organizations talk about Azure like it's a location. Move it to Azure. As soon as we're in Azure, once we get to Azure, we'll modernize. That language is the first tell that the program is about to drift into conditional chaos. Because Azure is not a destination, it's not someone else's data center. It's not a magic elasticity engine that turns legacy into modern by proximity. In architectural terms, Azure is a control plane, a distributed decision engine that can enforce your intent across identity, network, compute, data, and operations at scale if you actually define that intent in a way the platform can compile into policy. That distinction matters. On-prem, control is often social. A handful of infrastructure people know what good looks like, and everything routes through them. That model doesn't scale, but it feels safe because it's familiar. In Azure, the system will let you create almost anything, almost anywhere, with almost any shape of access, unless you prevent it. Azure is not a strict gatekeeper, it's an accelerant. So if your intent isn't encoded into governance, policy, identity boundaries, subscription design, logging requirements, then your organization isn't using Azure, it's renting entropy. Azure without governance is just outsourced entropy. And this is why landing zones exist at all. Not because Microsoft wanted a prettier reference diagram. Landing zones exist because enterprises need a way to make rules durable when the organization is not. You're not trying to build an Azure environment. You're trying to build an enterprise environment that happens to run on Azure. The real product you want out of Azure is not a VM or AKS or app service. The real product is standardization. Standard identity flows, standard network paths, standard policy enforcement, standard logging and evidence, standard subscription boundaries, because that's what gives you the only thing the business actually cares about, predictable change. And this is the executive framing that stops people from doing migration theater. Executives don't need a tour of services. They need a set of outcomes that the platform enables and a way to measure drift. Time to market, how long from idea to production without begging the platform team for exceptions. Risk and stability, whether the security posture stays consistent as more teams on board, and whether incident response can answer questions without archaeology. Cost to serve predictability. Not did we save money, but can we forecast the cost of running this workload without surprises? Organizational throughput. How many teams can move in parallel without each one inventing their own cloud? cloud migrations are justified by outcomes, not architectures. Now here's the uncomfortable truth. Most organizations treat governance like a compliance artifact. A spreadsheet, a deck, a set of best practices that people will follow because it's reasonable. They won't. Governance that relies on memory is not governance. It's a suggestion. In Azure, your governance has to be executable. That means policy-driven. It means identity-driven. It means designed into the paths teams use. So the right way is the easy way. Because if you make the secure path slower than the insecure path, you've created a market. And the business will buy speed. So Azure, correctly defined, becomes the platform where you enforce your assumptions at scale. It's where you decide where workloads may run, how they authenticate, how they route traffic, how they log and retain evidence, how blast radius is contained. And once those decisions exist as code and policy, then migration stops being improvisation. It becomes onboarding. That's the pivot. Migration is not move stuff. Migration is create a governed pathway, then move things through it. So when someone says, Azure is our destination, the correct response is no. Azure is the control plane that makes the destination possible. The destination is an organization that can ship change predictably, under control, without heroic exceptions. And that's why the next thing we have to talk about is landing zones, but not as diagrams. As an organizational contract, you either enforce or you don't. Failure story, cloud adoption without a platform. A financial services firm decided to unlock innovation by letting teams self-serve Azure subscriptions. Leadership intent sounded modern: move fast, reduce central bottlenecks, and let product teams build. What actually happened was not innovation, it was variance. Every team created its own subscription. Every subscription had its own naming, its own network decisions, its own logging choices, its own half-implemented security controls. Some teams deployed straight to public endpoints because it was faster. Others built private endpoints but didn't wire DNS correctly. A few teams created their own temporary Entra app registrations and service principals because the official process took too long. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The invisible constraint was that decentralization without a shared control plane doesn't create autonomy. It creates unbounded divergence. And divergence is expensive because it multiplies everything you have to govern. Every unique pattern requires a unique exception, a unique audit story, a unique incident response runbook, and a unique person who knows how that one works. Then the audit showed up. The audit didn't ask, do you have Azure? It asked, show me consistent controls. Where is your centralized logging? Where are your mandatory policies? How do you prove location restrictions, encryption requirements, and separation of duties? How do you ensure privileged access is controlled the same way across workloads? And the organization had no clean answer. Because there wasn't one Azure environment. There were hundreds of micro-environments, each with its own interpretation of reality. So the response was predictable. A panic centralization, a task force, a moratorium on new subscriptions, emergency policy assignments that broke workloads because teams had built against implicit freedoms. Suddenly, the innovation program became an exception-clearing operation. This is the part executives don't enjoy hearing. Self-service without guardrails does not scale. It never has. The preventing principle is simple. You build the platform first, then you give teams a paved road to consume it. That means a landing zone exists before the first subscription is vended. Subscription creation is not an ad hoc portal activity. It is an enforced pathway with defaults, management group placement, baseline policies, logging, networking integration, and identity patterns already attached. Because if you let teams create the foundational shape of the cloud, you're not democratizing innovation. You're outsourcing architecture to whoever needed something on a Tuesday afternoon. And once that happens, the platform team's job becomes archaeology, not enablement. So if your leadership wants teams can innovate faster in Azure, the real translation is teams can innovate faster when they don't have to reinvent identity, networking, security, logging, and compliance every time they deploy. That only happens when the platform exists first. Which brings us to the non-negotiable piece everyone tries to treat as a diagram, the landing zone contract. Landing zones are an organizational contract, not a diagram. Landing zones are routinely misunderstood because people look at the picture and think the picture is the thing. It isn't. A landing zone is an organizational contract, a set of enforceable boundaries that define how the enterprise will operate in Azure. Not best practices, not recommended architecture, a contract. Because the business doesn't need an architecture diagram. The business needs predictable outcomes. And predictable outcomes require predictable constraints. A landing zone contract has a few components that have to be explicit, owned, and enforced. Identity and access, who can do what, where, and under what conditions. This is Entra, RBAC, privileged access, conditional access, and the life cycle of identities. In other words, the right people using the right accounts through the right flows, every time. Network topology and connectivity, where traffic flows, how it's inspected, how DNS works, how private access is achieved, and how hybrid connectivity is handled. This is the difference between we can reach it and we can defend it. Security posture, the baseline expectations that don't vary by team mood. logging, Defender configurations, Sentinel integration if you run it, mandatory encryption, key management decisions. The point isn't to be perfect. The point is to be consistent. Compliance and policy, the rules that are executable, region restrictions, tagging, resource constraints, audit requirements, not policies as documentation, policies as enforcement. Subscription management, how you create blast radius boundaries, how you separate environments, how you allocate budgets, and how you keep teams from turning one subscription into a shared junk drawer. And notice what's absent from that list: workloads, because landing zones are not about the apps. Landing zones are about the environment that makes apps survivable at scale. This is why the statement matters. If your first migration task is moving workloads, you've already failed. Because if the platform isn't real, you have no contract. And if you have no contract, every workload becomes a negotiation. Teams will negotiate for public endpoints. They will negotiate for temporary exclusions. They will negotiate for one-off identity patterns. They will negotiate for relaxed policies just for this release. And you will approve them, not because you're reckless, because you're trying to ship. But every approved negotiation becomes a permanent pathway, and those pathways accumulate. So let's separate two concepts that get conflated: platform landing zone versus application landing zones. The platform landing zone is the shared enterprise substrate. Management groups, policy assignments, shared services subscriptions, centralized logging, connectivity patterns, and identity boundaries. This is owned by a platform team, not as a committee. As a product, application landing zones are where workloads live. They inherit the contract. They don't redefine it. This boundary matters because it separates how the enterprise stays safe and governable from how teams deliver features. When you blur it, you either slow delivery to a crawl with centralized approvals, or you lose control through uncontrolled divergence. In regulated industries like financial services and healthcare, landing zones are not optional because the audit doesn't care how fast you migrated. The audit cares whether the control narrative is coherent. Without landing zones, you can't tell a coherent story. You have inconsistent evidence, inconsistent logging, inconsistent access models, inconsistent network controls. You don't just have gaps, you have ambiguity, and ambiguity is where investigations go to die. Skipping landing zones also removes your rollback story. People love to talk about rollback like it's a technical plan: restore a backup, flip DNS back, fail over. But operational rollback is governance rollback. If you don't know what policies were in place, who had access, what logs exist, and what changed during the migration window, you can't roll back to known good. You can only roll back to, we hope this is close enough. That's not a plan. That's wishful thinking. So when someone asks, do we really need landing zones? The right answer is, you need a contract before you need a migration, because migration is an onboarding process into that contract. And if you don't define the contract up front, your organization will still create one. It'll just be accidental. And accidental contracts always favor speed over control until the bill arrives. The hierarchy, management groups, and environment-first governance. Once you accept that a landing zone is a contract, you need a place to hang that contract where it won't get rewritten every time someone reorganizes the company. That place is the management group hierarchy. And this is where most organizations commit the quietest, most expensive mistake. They mirror the org chart. They build management groups for retail banking, commercial, wealth, claims, research, manufacturing ops, whatever the current shape of the business is. It feels intuitive. It is also fragility encoded as governance. Because org charts change faster than policy can follow, mergers happen, leaders reshuffle, teams split, combine, rename, and get realigned quarterly. Your policy set doesn't, your audit narrative doesn't, your security controls shouldn't. So the firm position is environment-first hierarchy: prod, non-prod, sandbox. And then underneath that, carve by exposure and dependency, not by politics. Corp versus online is useful because network and threat models differ. Regulated versus non-regulated is useful because control requirements differ. Confidential versus standard is useful because incident response and key management differ. But the org chart is not a stable boundary. If your cloud hierarchy mirrors your org chart, you've built fragility into governance. Management groups are not a reporting structure. They are policy inheritance surfaces. That distinction matters. A management group is basically a scope where you attach rules that should apply to everything beneath it. Azure policy assignments, RBAC role assignments, compliance initiatives, guardrails that should be consistent without negotiation. Subscriptions, on the other hand, are blast radius boundaries. They are where you contain failure, cost blowouts, quota consumption, accidental deletion, noisy neighbor resource contention, and operational mistakes. A subscription is not just a billing container. It's the boundary that lets you say, this team can break their stuff without breaking everyone else's. So the hierarchy does two jobs at once. Management groups propagate intent. Subscriptions contain consequences. Now translate that into an environment-first model. At the top, you have your root and your platform governance. Then you create environment management groups, prod, non-prod, sandbox. Under those, you create workload categories like corp and online or whatever your threat model requires. Why does this work? Because it maps cleanly to audit narratives. Auditors don't care which VP owns the system this month. They care that production has tighter controls than non-production, that separation of duties exists, that changes are controlled, and that logging and evidence are consistent. Environment-first hierarchy gives you that story without improvisation. Pod policies, stricter location enforcement, stricter network rules, deny public endpoints where possible, mandatory diagnostic settings, longer log retention, stricter RBAC, tighter privileged access controls. Non-prod policies, similar shape but with intentionally relaxed constraints where it's rational, still governed but less punitive. Sandbox, guardrails that prevent stupidity from becoming a breach report, but enough freedom for experimentation without filing tickets for every idea. And because those rules are inherited through management groups, you don't rebuild governance per subscription. You don't negotiate it per project. You attach it once, and then you vend subscriptions into the correct place. That's the point. This hierarchy becomes the subscription vending machine's target map. When a team requests a new production subscription, it lands under prod, inherits prod policies, attaches to shared services, and comes with logging and budget baselines. When a team requests a dev test subscription, it lands under non-prod, inherits the right baseline, and still stays observable and supportable. And here's the part people miss until the first incident. Environment-first governance is how you preserve separation of duties without turning your platform team into a gatekeeper. Because separation of duties is not nobody can do anything, it is the system makes it hard to do the wrong thing and easy to do the right thing with clear ownership boundaries. Management groups enforce the baseline, subscriptions isolate the impact, and teams still ship. This is also why mirroring the org chart fails so badly in financial services and healthcare. The moment a subscription moves because a business unit changes, your inherited policy changes, your logging changes, your access model changes, your compliance scope changes, you've just turned an HR decision into a security change. That's not governance, that's conditional chaos. So set the hierarchy by environment first. Then treat subscriptions as controlled blast radiuses, and you'll finally have a foundation that survives reorganizations, supports audits, and scales onboarding without relitigating every rule for every team. Shared services, subscriptions, identity, security, connectivity, management. Once the hierarchy is environment first, you need to build the shared services layer that every workload will quietly depend on. This is where "we'll centralize later" dies in reality, because shared services aren't optional conveniences. They're the things that make your controls consistent and your operations survivable. So the platform landing zone needs shared services subscriptions that are boring, obvious, and defended: identity, security, connectivity, and management. Start with the identity boundary, because everything else is downstream of who is allowed to do what. Single tenant by default, central ownership, teams consume identity, they never design it. That is not ideology, it is failure prevention. Identity failures don't degrade gracefully, they cascade. They create parallel authentication paths, inconsistent conditional access, and audit trails that can't answer basic questions like which identity accessed this data, from which device, under what conditions. And once you let one app temporarily bypass the standard identity model, you've created a second truth, then a third, then incident response becomes archaeology. You can decentralize workloads, you cannot decentralize identity. So the platform team owns Entra ID patterns, naming conventions for groups, lifecycle for app registrations, privileged access via PIM, conditional access baselines, and the documented "how do we onboard an app" flow. Apps don't get to improvise identity because they were in a hurry. Next is the security subscription, and yes, it deserves its own boundary. Security tooling is not just another shared service, it is the part of the platform that must remain trustworthy when everything else is on fire. Centralized logging, Microsoft Sentinel if you're using it, Defender for cloud configuration, alert routing, and incident response automation belong here. The point is separation of duties and blast radius. If an attacker compromises a workload subscription, they should not be able to tamper with the monitoring that detects them. If an internal admin makes a mistake in a workload subscription, it should not break the organization's ability to investigate it. So security goes into its own subscription, under its own management group, with its own access model. Tight, minimal, auditable, then connectivity. This is where too many organizations get clever too early and end up with a network that only the person who built it can explain. Connectivity is the shared pathway, the hub, the firewall or inspection layer, DNS, private endpoints alignment, express route or VPN termination, and the routing model that keeps traffic predictable. And because we're going to take a firm stance later, hub and spoke first. That means the connectivity subscription owns the hub and the shared controls, and workloads consume it through spokes or peering patterns that are standardized. You are not building a bespoke network per application. You are building one network posture that apps are allowed to attach to. Early on, boring networks beat clever ones. Finally, management. This is not monitoring as a tool. This is management as an operating discipline, log analytics, workspaces for platform signals, update management if you use it, backup and recovery patterns, inventory, and the baseline observability contract that says every workload produces logs, metrics, and traces in a consistent way, with retention that matches your risk profile. Because without management, every team will pick a different logging approach, and you won't get correlation, you'll get noise. Now, the mistake people make is thinking they can build workloads first and retrofit shared services later. They can't. Once teams have shipped with local logging, local DNS hacks, local identity exceptions, and local security tools, those decisions become dependencies. And dependencies have political weight. You can't change that. It'll break production. So drift becomes permanent. That's why we'll centralize later fails. Not because centralization is hard, but because undoing distributed decisions is harder than making them. Shared services are the paved road. Without them, every team builds a goat trail. And goat trails don't converge into highways. They converge into a map nobody trusts. So build the shared services subscriptions early, wire them to the management group hierarchy, and make them the default dependency for every new subscription that gets vended. Because once shared services exist, onboarding stops being negotiation. It becomes a repeatable pathway. Network topology stance, hub and spoke first. VW on earns its keep. Now we get to the part where enterprise migrations quietly die. The network. Not because networking is hard in Azure. It's hard everywhere. It dies because people treat network topology as a preference, not a constraint system. They pick whatever looks modern, whatever the last architect used, whatever a partner sells, and then they retrofit security and operations around it. That's backwards. In a migration, the network is the policy delivery mechanism. It determines where traffic can go, what it can touch, what gets inspected, what gets logged, and how quickly you can explain a path during an incident review. So the position is firm. Hub and spoke first, always. Why? Because in early migrations, you are not optimizing for elegance. You are optimizing for predictability under stress. Hub and spoke gives you one place to centralize the things that must be consistent. Egress control, inspection, DNS, and the you can't just open a public endpoint because you're in a hurry problem. It also gives you a clean story in audio. One hub per region, spokes per workload subscription, shared controls in the hub, workloads attached through a defined pattern. If someone asks how does traffic leave, you can answer in one sentence. Early on, boring networks beat clever ones. Now, the practical rationale. Most enterprises start with hybrid reality, data centers, MPLS, express route or VPN, legacy DNS, and dependencies that still assume RFC 1918 space and predictable routing. Hub and spoke maps to that. It gives you a single termination point for hybrid connectivity and a single place to enforce inspection before traffic hits the internet or your on-prem network. And inspection is not optional. Even if you don't run a full firewall stack day one, you still need centralized egress control and a path that can be instrumented. Because we'll add inspection later, turns into we built a distributed bypass network and now everything depends on it. That's not a security gap. That's architecture drift. DNS is the other quiet killer. Private endpoints only work cleanly when DNS is consistent. Hub and spoke lets you centralize private DNS zones, DNS forwarding, and resolver patterns, so applications don't invent their own name, resolution hacks. If each spoke team does DNS their own way, private endpoints become a weekly incident. Then there's the real enterprise constraint, routing exceptions. Every exception you add to just make this one app work becomes a permanent routing rule someone has to remember exists. Over time, you get hub sprawl, multiple hubs, inconsistent UDRs, inconsistent peering, and temporary transitive routing that nobody can defend in an audit. So the contract is one hub per region owned by the platform team. Spokes are cheap and disposable. Spokes are where workloads live. The hub is where rules live. Now about VDO 1, Virtual 1 is not bad. It is not the enemy, it's just not your first move. VWAN earns its keep when three conditions are already true. You already operate globally, you already understand your traffic patterns, and you already have network operations maturity that can handle an abstracted routing fabric without turning every outage into portal archaeology. Because VDO 1 optimizes for scale and connectivity complexity. Lots of branches, lots of regions, lots of routing domains, lots of interconnect needs. But early migrations don't need that. Early migrations need a topology you can reason about when something breaks at 2 a.m. and hub and spoke wins that trade every time. So the rule is simple. Start with hub and spoke. Instrument it, stabilize it, make it boring. Then if your footprint and routing complexity justify it, migrate to VW1 deliberately with a plan, with testing, with clear ownership. Not as a we should be cloud native gesture. Because cloud native networking isn't a topology. It's your ability to enforce intent consistently while the organization keeps changing. And the only network that helps you do that early is the one you can explain, secure, and troubleshoot without improvising. Failure story, the identity exception that became a breach report. A bank had a critical legacy application that couldn't authenticate cleanly with their standard Entra patterns. It was old, it was fragile, it had a vendor integration nobody wanted to touch. Leadership intent was the usual: approve one exception, keep the migration moving, and normalize it later. Later never arrives. What actually happened was predictable in slow motion. They stood up a parallel authentication path, a separate app registration, a separate set of conditional access exclusions because the legacy client couldn't meet modern requirements, a separate service account pattern because the vendor needed it. And because the app mattered, every control around it became negotiable. So now they had two identity realities inside one tenant, the governed path and the temporary path. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The invisible constraint they ignored was that identity is not a feature, it's the enforcement layer for everything else. Zero trust depends on consistency. Conditional access only works when you don't let workloads define their own rules. The moment you allow a parallel path, you've created an unmanaged surface that your monitoring and response processes don't understand. And the weird part is how this shows up operationally. Access reviews started failing because the group and role model for that app didn't match the standard life cycles. Security couldn't answer basic questions like who has access and why, because why was a Slack thread from 6 months ago. The platform team couldn't remove the exclusions because the business would treat it as an outage. So the exception became permanent, and permanent exceptions become invisible. People stop seeing them as risk. They see them as how that system works. Then a contractor account was compromised, not a sophisticated nation state, just credential reuse and bad hygiene. The attacker didn't need to break into the governed systems. They didn't need to fight the conditional access baseline. They walked through the exception path because exceptions are where intent goes to die. The breach report was brutal, not because data was exfiltrated at scale, but because the organization couldn't prove containment quickly. Incident response couldn't trace access cleanly across the parallel identity pathways. The audit questions were simple and devastating. Why did this exception exist? Who approved it? What compensating controls were in place? And why didn't monitoring flag the access pattern earlier? They had no clean answers because they didn't design the exception. They tolerated it, and you can't audit tolerance. The principle that would have prevented it is boring and absolute. Centralized identity, consistent access patterns, and zero exceptions that create parallel authentication paths. If a workload can't comply, you don't carve a hole in identity. You sequence the workload, you isolate it, or you keep it where it is until you can make it compliant. You can decentralize workloads. You cannot decentralize identity. So now that the platform contract is real, management groups, shared services, hub and spoke, centralized identity, the next step is where most programs still fail, choosing what moves first. Workload prioritization is portfolio management, not a migration queue. Most enterprises treat migration like a queue. Whatever screams loudest goes first. The oldest hardware, the expiring data center lease, the app with the most noise from users, the system a VP cares about. That is not a strategy, that is emotional routing. Workload prioritization is portfolio management. It is the discipline of deciding where you want to spend limited change capacity, because migration capacity is finite, not because Azure has limits, because your organization does. You have a limited number of people who can do discovery without lying to themselves, a limited number of teams who can remediate dependencies without breaking upstream systems, a limited governance throughput for access changes and policy enforcement, a limited ability to run parallel systems without burning out operations. So the portfolio has to be triaged, not queued. Start with 4 dimensions that are simple enough to say out loud and brutal enough to be useful. Business criticality: if it fails, what breaks? Revenue, customer trust, regulatory exposure, patient outcomes, plant operations. This is not important, and this is consequence. Technical complexity: not is it old, but how tangled are the dependencies? How stateful is it? How coupled is it? How hard is rollback? And how many integrations will retaliate when you touch it? Regulatory exposure: what control narrative is required, what audit evidence is required, and how intolerant is the system to changes in identity, logging, and data residency. Modernization readiness: do you have tests? Do you have CI/CD? Do you have an owner who can make decisions? Do you have a team with the skills to change it? And do you have a path to operate it differently once it moves? That distinction matters because readiness is not enthusiasm. It's whether the workload can survive contact with reality. Now, the executive lens has to be explicit because otherwise prioritization devolves into politics. Revenue impact: does this workload enable growth or just keep lights on? Risk reduction: will moving it reduce operational risk, security risk, or compliance risk in a measurable way? Team capability maturity: can the team operate with automation, observability, and disciplined change, or are they still in ticket-driven survival mode? If you don't include team capability maturity, your plan becomes a fantasy. You will schedule refactors that the organization cannot execute. And this is where we need the migration path stated plainly. 4 paths, no euphemisms. Rehost: move it as is. Tactical, temporary, sometimes necessary. It buys time, but it does not buy modernization. It also preserves technical debt, so you need to be honest about that. Replatform, move it with low-friction upgrades that reduce operational pain. Managed databases, app service, containerization where it's justified, standard logging and identity patterns. This is where you get early wins without rewriting the business. Refactor, change the architecture to exploit cloud-native behaviors. Decouple services, replace brittle integrations, build for scalability and resilience. This is strategic, expensive, and only worth it when the workload is a differentiator. Retire, delete it, replace it, shut it down. This is the most ignored option and often the highest ROI. Not every workload deserves modernization, some deserve deletion. Now, the sequencing logic. Most organizations want to modernize the hardest systems first because it feels like bravery. It is usually stupidity. Crown jewels don't go first. They go after the platform proves it can enforce intent, and after teams prove they can operate inside the constraints without improvisations. So what moves first? You start with workloads that are meaningful enough to test the platform, but not so critical that a learning experience becomes a business incident. That usually means a customer-facing web application with moderate criticality and a standard stack. You replatform it. You don't rewrite it. You use it to teach teams the contract, subscription boundaries, CI/CD expectations, logging baselines, and identity patterns. This is where teams learn how the platform really works. Then you address the systems that are business critical but intolerant to change: core financial batch, overnight processing, settlement, risk runs. Those systems are not where you prove cloud-native purity. They are where you prove stability. So you rehost first with discipline, deterministic rollback, parallel run where it's feasible, validation gates, and explicit sign-off from the business. Rehosting here is not laziness, it's sequencing. And while everyone argues about cloud native, you quietly reclaim runway by killing junk. Internal reporting tools with low usage, undocumented shadow IT, duplicate data marts, one-off workflows that exist because nobody had the courage to say no. Retire them, don't migrate them, don't refactor them, end them. The cheapest modernization is deletion. The point of this portfolio framing is that migration is not a heroic march. It is a controlled reduction of entropy. You are building a governed pathway and then moving the right things through it in the right order with outcomes you can measure. Because if you don't choose intentionally, the business will choose for you. And the business will choose urgency over coherence every single time. Next, we'll do this as a verbal tabletop exercise with 3 workloads so you can hear the decision logic in motion, not as a framework diagram. Tabletop triage. Workload 1, customer-facing web app, replatform. Take workload 1, a customer-facing web application in financial services. Not the core ledger, not the overnight batch. Something real, revenue adjacent, but not the crown jewels. Profile it quickly. Medium criticality. If it's down, customers complain and conversions drop, but the bank doesn't stop settling transactions. Moderate change frequency. The business wants tweaks every sprint or two. Standard stack, web front end, API layer, a database, maybe a caching tier, and a couple integrations to systems of record that still live elsewhere. This workload is where programs should start because it exposes reality without detonating the company. Now the decision: replatform, not refactor, not cloud-native rewrite, replatform. In other words, move it into Azure and make a few low-friction choices that reduce operational drag immediately without pretending you can redesign the business logic on day one. So what does replatform mean in practice without turning this into Azure feature bingo? It means you deliberately trade fragile, bespoke operational responsibilities for managed ones. You standardize how it deploys. You standardize how it authenticates. You standardize how it emits logs. You standardize how it connects to dependencies. And you inherit the landing zone contract instead of negotiating it. This is where teams learn how the platform really works. Because the first lesson most teams learn in Azure is not about compute. It's about constraints. They learn that a subscription is not an empty canvas. It's an environment with inherited policy. They learn that networks have a shape and egress isn't open by default. They learn that identity isn't whatever the app needs, it's whatever the platform can audit and control. They learn that logging is not optional because we'll add monitoring later. It's part of the contract. So for this workload, the controls should be explicit upfront. Landing zone inheritance: the subscription lands in the correct management group, picks up baseline policy, and gets attached to shared services patterns. No bespoke exceptions. If it needs an exception, that's a signal the platform contract is incomplete, not that the app is special. CI/CD expectations. It deploys through a pipeline with gated promotion into production, with a rollback pattern that doesn't require heroics. Even if the code is ugly, deployment should be boring. Boring is the point. Observability baseline. The app produces logs, metrics, and traces in the standard way the platform expects. If the incident response team can't answer what changed and what failed without hunting through 5 dashboards you didn't replatform. You relocate it, and then you choose the minimal modernization moves that reduce operational cost to serve. Maybe you move the database to a managed service so patching stops being a midnight ritual. Maybe you move static content to a service that scales predictably. Maybe you modernize secrets so the team stops hard-coding credentials into deployment pipelines like it's 2009. But the key is sequencing. The goal is to remove operational friction first, because operational friction is what kills time to market. And time to market is what executives actually notice. Now, why is this workload first? Because it creates a learning loop with tolerable consequences. Teams will misinterpret policies. They will hit networking assumptions they didn't know they had. They will discover their simple app depends on a legacy authentication flow, a DNS shortcut, or a database permission model that only worked because it lived inside the data center. Good, that's the point. You want to discover those constraints while the blast radius is small. And you want to turn those discoveries into platform improvements, not one-off fixes. So the output of this first migration isn't the app is in Azure. The output is you now have a repeatable pattern for a class of workloads, and you have hardened the landing zone contract based on real behavior. That's compounding. And once that pattern exists, you can scale. You can onboard another customer-facing app without reinventing everything. You can measure provisioning speed, deployment frequency, incident rates, and cost variance with a baseline you trust. Then, and only then, you earn the right to touch workload 2, the core financial batch system that doesn't tolerate learning experiences. Tabletop triage, workload 2, core financial batch, rehost now, refactor later. Workload 2 is the one executives always want to modernize properly first because it sounds like courage. The core financial batch system. This is the overnight processing layer, settlement runs, risk calculations, end-of-day reconciliations. The stuff that doesn't show up in your marketing site, but quietly keeps the institution solvent and compliant. Profile it honestly. Business critical. If it fails, you don't have a bad user experience. You have a regulatory incident, missed cutoffs, downstream systems in undefined states, and finance calling people at home. Low change tolerance. This workload was built to be stable, not flexible. Deep legacy dependencies, file drops, brittle schedules, mainframe adjacencies, that one database nobody is allowed to touch, and a chain of consumers that assume the batch finishes by 5 a.m. or the day is ruined. So what's the decision? Rehost now, refactor later. And yes, that offends the cloud-native purists. That's fine. They don't run the risk register. Rehosting here is not laziness, it's sequencing. Because the primary objective for this workload is not innovation. It's continuity under control. The business wants the same outputs on the same schedule with the same evidence, and ideally fewer late-night outages caused by dying hardware. So you move it with minimal functional change but maximum operational discipline. That distinction matters. A bad rehost is copy the VMs, hope it runs, and call it done. A good rehost is treat the migration as a controlled experiment with a deterministic rollback story and validation gates that are brutal. Start with the real constraint nobody wants to say out loud. Batch is a dependency graph, not a server. The batch job you think you're migrating is probably just one node in a chain. Upstream data extraction, transformation, load, reconciliation, report generation, and distribution. And half of those jobs are really just protocols. A file placed in a folder, a naming convention, a log file, an email alert, a runbook step someone does manually at 2 a.m. So the first question isn't what size VM do we need, it's what are the upstream and downstream contracts and how do we prove they still hold? Now the controls. You need a deterministic rollback plan, not we can restore from backup. Deterministic means if validation fails, you know exactly how you return to the last known good state and you've rehearsed it. You don't improvise rollback on a system that closes the books. Then you use a parallel run strategy where it's feasible. Run the batch in Azure and on-prem in parallel for a defined period, compare outputs, reconcile differences, and only then cut over. Not forever, not until we feel good, but long enough to cover real scenarios. Month-end, quarter-end, unusual volumes, and the ugly edge cases that only show up when auditors are watching. Then you put validation gates in writing. Completeness, did every expected output land? Accuracy, do totals reconcile? Timeliness, did it finish inside the window? Security posture, did identity and access behave as expected? And are logs retained where they need to be? And this is where the platform matters again. If your landing zone contract is real, you can place this workload into an environment with known controls, known logging, known network paths. Without that, every validation failure turns into an argument about whether the platform is stable or the workload is weird. You lose time in ambiguity. Now, why refactor later? Because refactoring batch is architectural surgery. It often means breaking tight coupling, replacing file-based integration with event-driven patterns, changing data models, rewriting scheduling and orchestration, and renegotiating every downstream consumer contract. That is not phase one work. You refactor after you've stabilized operations, after you've proven observability, after the team has capacity, and after the platform has earned trust. Then refactoring becomes a choice with a business case, not an ideological requirement to be cloud native. So the output of workload 2 isn't modernization. It's a stable, governed relocation that buys you time, reduces hardware risk, and sets up modernization without betting the bank on it. Tabletop triage, workload 3, internal reporting, shadow IT, retire. Workload 3 is the one nobody puts on the migration roadmap, even though it quietly consumes the most capacity. Internal reporting, shadow IT, the access database that became critical. The spreadsheet-driven workflow with a service account that everyone shares. The Power BI report pointed at an old data mart that nobody patches because nobody owns it. Profile it honestly. Low usage. 10 people scream when it's down and you confuse that for importance. Poor documentation. If the original builder left, you have folklore, not runbooks. Duplicate functionality. It overlaps with the enterprise reporting platform, the finance warehouse, or the new analytics stack that will replace it someday. And yet it sits in the migration queue like it deserves investment. It doesn't. The decision here is retire, not rehost quickly, not move it because it's easy, but retire it. Because migration capacity is finite and this class of workload is pure distraction. It burns engineering time, adds audit scope, increases identity sprawl, and creates more exceptions that have to be defended forever. The cheapest modernization is deletion. Now, retirement isn't turn it off and hope nobody notices. It's a controlled removal with a replacement narrative, because the business will always ask the same question: what do we lose? So you do three things. First, you quantify the distraction cost. How many hours a month does the organization spend maintaining it, troubleshooting it, or feeding it data manually? How often does it break during month end because the underlying extract failed? How many people have access to it and how many of those accesses are justified? If you can't put a number on it, you can't retire it because you lose the argument to sentiment. Second, you shrink the risk surface before you kill it. Lock down access, remove shared credentials, stop the service account sprawl. Put it into a controlled read-only state if you can. You're not improving it because it deserves improvement. You're preventing it from becoming a breach report while you decommission it. Third, you replace the outcome, not the tool. If the report exists because finance needs a daily liquidity view, then you migrate that requirement to the enterprise reporting platform. If the app exists because operations needs a weekly inventory dashboard, build that dashboard in the system that already owns inventory. The point is, the business requirement survives. The shadow implementation doesn't. And here's the governance payoff most people miss. Every retired workload buys you back policy coherence. It reduces exceptions, it reduces temporary firewall rules, it reduces weird identity artifacts that nobody wants to own, it reduces logging pipelines pointed at systems that shouldn't exist. It reduces your audit scope, which is real money in regulated industries. Deletion is not just cost savings, it's entropy reduction. And entropy reduction is what increases throughput. Because once you stop migrating junk, you have capacity to migrate systems that matter. Your platform team stops spending time supporting edge case nonsense. Your security team stops chasing phantom assets. Your delivery teams stop inheriting undocumented liabilities. This is why portfolio management matters. A migration program that never retires anything will eventually stall. Not because Azure is hard, but because every moved workload increases the number of things you have to govern. Retiring workloads is how you stop the migration factory from drowning in its own output. So by the time you've replatformed a customer-facing app, rehosted the core batch safely, and retired the internal junk, you've done something rare. You've created momentum without creating drift, and now you can finally talk about execution at scale. Phased modernization with a foundation that doesn't collapse under success. Phased modernization. Evolve, don't boil the ocean. Now, the uncomfortable truth. Once you can triage workloads, you still don't have a migration strategy. You have a list of decisions. The strategy is how those decisions compound without collapsing your organization. And that's why Big Bang Modernize Everything programs fail. Not because they're ambitious, because they create too many simultaneous moving parts. Platform changes, workload changes, operating model changes, security model changes, and cost model changes, all at once. That is not transformation, that is uncontrolled coupling. So the right model is phased modernization. Evolve, don't boil the ocean. 3 phases, simple enough to repeat, strict enough to enforce. Phase 1 is foundation, phase 2 is migration at scale, phase 3 is modernization. And yes, it sounds obvious, that's the point. If your program can't be explained in 1 minute, it won't survive the first executive reshuffle. Start with phase 1, foundation. This is where you build the platform contract we've already been talking about. Landing zones, management group hierarchy, shared services, identity boundaries, networking, policy baselines, and observability. But phase 1 also includes the thing people consistently forget, the migration factory setup, not a project team. A factory, a repeatable delivery system that turns a workload from "we think we understand it" into "it's running in Azure, validated and supportable." That means standards, runbooks, a definition of done, validation criteria, rollback patterns, exception handling that is explicit, tracked, and treated as an entropy generator. Because exceptions aren't just technical debt, they are governance debt with interest. And if you don't build the factory discipline before you scale, you will scale inconsistency. Which brings us to phase 2, migration at scale. This is where you stop treating each migration as an artisanal exercise. You run waves. Each wave follows the same cadence. Discover, map dependencies, decide path, move, validate, stabilize, and you measure outcomes, not activity. Provisioning speed, how fast can a team get an environment that is production ready? Deployment frequency, are teams shipping more often without heroics? Incident trends, are incidents decreasing, and when they happen, is recovery faster? Cost variance, can you forecast spend per workload, or is it a surprise every month? Organizational throughput, how many teams can move safely in parallel without collapsing central governance? If you can't measure those, you're not running a factory, you're running a parade. And the factory model is what prevents the platform team from becoming a ticket queue. It creates paved roads, self-service with enforced guardrails, subscription vending that lands in the right management group, default policies, default logging, default network integration, default identity patterns. Teams get autonomy where autonomy is safe. They do not get autonomy where autonomy creates conditional chaos. Now, phase 3, modernization. This is where everyone wants to start. It's the shiny part. Containers, managed services, event-driven integration, data platform evolution, cloud-native everything. And this is where the program dies if you do it too early. Because modernization is a lagging indicator of platform maturity. If the platform can't provide consistent identity, network, policy, and observability, modernization becomes probabilistic. You can build something impressive, but you can't operate it consistently across teams. So it rots, or it becomes bespoke, or it becomes a dependency nobody understands. Same outcome, different packaging. So modernization has to be earned. You modernize when the organization can repeatedly deploy, monitor, secure, and recover workloads in the new environment without improvisation. Then modernization compounds. You can adopt managed services because operational patterns are standardized. You can containerize where it's justified because CI/CD, networking, and observability are stable. You can move toward event-driven integration because your identity and security posture can survive distributed systems. And here's the trap to call out explicitly. Forcing refactoring early kills momentum. It inflates timelines, creates architectural debates instead of delivery, and turns the program into a standards war. Meanwhile, the data center lease clock keeps ticking, and the business stops believing you can execute. So you sequence. Stabilize first, scale next, modernize when the platform can carry it, and through all 3 phases you budget technical debt instead of pretending it will sort itself out, because it won't. Debt either gets paid deliberately or it gets paid during incidents, audits, and outages. Phased modernization is how you choose the payment schedule. And once you accept that, the migration program stops being a stressful sprint toward a date. It becomes a controlled enterprise capability, a system that keeps producing migrations safely with outcomes that improve over time. Next, we make phase 1 explicit, what has to exist before the factory starts running. Phase 1, foundation, landing zones, plus connectivity, plus policy, plus identity. Phase 1 is where most migration programs try to save time. And that's why they lose a year later. Foundation isn't a diagram, and it isn't a workshop. It's the moment you turn intent into something the platform can enforce when nobody's watching. So phase 1 has deliverables, real ones. If you can't point to them, you don't have a foundation. You have a slide deck. First, the platform landing zone exists as deployed code, not as a reference. Management group hierarchy, subscription vending pathway, shared services subscriptions, policy assignments, RBAC baseline, naming, tagging, diagnostic settings, the boring parts that stop every future workload from becoming a bespoke argument. Second, connectivity is implemented as a standard service, not a per-app adventure. Hub and spoke, 1 hub per region, and a routing model you can explain without apologizing. This is where you decide egress control, DNS patterns, private endpoint strategy, and hybrid termination. If you don't define these upfront, every team will define them for you. Badly. Third, identity is locked down as a platform capability. Single tenant by default, central ownership, standard onboarding for apps, PIM for privileged access, conditional access baselines that reflect your risk profile, not whatever got copy-pasted last year. Identity is where you decide whether your security model is deterministic or probabilistic. Fourth, policy as code becomes the muscle, not an aspiration. Azure Policy isn't compliance reporting, it's the enforcement mechanism that keeps your platform contract from decaying into exceptions. Tag policies, location restrictions, deny public endpoints where rational, mandatory diagnostic settings, required encryption settings, and a clear rule for exceptions. They are entropy generators, and every entropy generator has an owner, a ticket, an expiry date, and compensating controls. Now, the migration factory prerequisites. This is the part leaders love to skip because it looks like process. But the factory is what converts migration from hero team to organizational throughput. So you define standards, what a migrated workload must have before it's considered done, logging integrated, alerts routed, backup strategy defined, identity pattern compliant, network paths predictable, documentation updated, ownership assigned, cost tags present, a runbook that can survive the original engineer going on leave. You define runbooks, cutover steps, validation steps, and rollback steps. Not we'll figure it out. Written steps with owners. You define validation criteria, functional validation, performance baselines, security posture checks, and business sign-off gates. If you don't define validation, you will accept it seems fine, and seems fine is how you get audited. You define rollback patterns, not a one-off per migration, but a repeatable approach. Parallel runs where possible, traffic cutover strategy, data consistency validation, and explicit conditions that trigger rollback without debate. And then you build the operating rhythm. Phase 1 isn't just building assets, it's establishing the discipline to keep them stable, code reviews, change control, deployment pipelines for the platform itself, and a cadence for policy updates that doesn't turn governance into surprise outages. Now tie it back to financial services because that's where the lie gets exposed fastest. Finance doesn't care that your landing zone is aligned with best practices. Finance cares that you can prove separation of duties, that privileged access is controlled, that evidence exists, and that changes are traceable. So the foundation must include auditability as a first-class requirement, not a future enhancement. Separation of duties isn't an org chart statement. It's enforced pathways. Platform owners manage the contract, application teams consume it, security tooling stays protected, and approvals are engineered into pipelines where it matters. This is also where you make peace with the real trade-off. Governance isn't free, but neither is chaos. If you want faster time to market, you don't remove guardrails. You standardize them so teams stop negotiating them. If you want stability, you don't rely on heroics. You rely on repeatable environments and predictable controls. If you want predictable cost to serve, you don't hope people tag resources. You enforce tags, budgets, and visibility. Phase 1 is the moment you decide whether Azure will reduce entropy or just host it more expensively. So make Phase 1 non-negotiable. Ship the landing zone. Ship the shared services. Ship the identity and policy contract. Ship the network. Ship the factory definitions. Then, and only then, you start the assembly line. Phase 2, migration at scale, factory model plus repeatable validation. Phase 2 is where the fantasy either becomes a delivery system or it becomes a backlog with nicer branding. This is the migration factory, an assembly line that produces consistent outcomes, not heroic one-offs. And the only way it works is if you standardize the boring parts so teams can spend their creativity on the parts that actually matter. Every migration wave should run the same cadence: discover, map dependencies, decide the path, move, validate, stabilize, not because you love process, because repeatability is how you prevent entropy from scaling faster than your governance. Discovery isn't we found the servers. It's application dependency reality, identity flows, DNS assumptions, inbound and outbound traffic, certificates, batch schedules, file drops, and the quiet integration points that don't show up in diagrams but absolutely show up during cutover. Then you decide the path explicitly. Rehost, replatform, refactor, retire. No hybrid euphemisms. If you can't say which one it is, you're about to accidentally refactor a workload you meant to rehost, then you move. But the move is not the milestone. Validation is the milestone. Validation has to be standardized, ruthless, and boring. And it needs 4 gates. First, completeness. Did every required component land where it should, with the right dependencies, in the right subscription, under the right management group, inheriting the right policies? Second, performance baseline. Not it seems fast. Baseline it against what the business expects, then measure. If performance changes, you explain why, and you decide whether that change is acceptable before you declare success. Third, security posture. Identity patterns compliant, network paths predictable, logs flowing to the expected destinations, and alerts routed to the right responders. If the workload can't be monitored and investigated, it is not migrated. It is hidden. Fourth, business sign-off. The people who own outcomes, not the people who own Terraform, confirm the workflow is correct. After validation comes stabilization, and this is where most programs lie to themselves. They say they'll optimize later. Later becomes never. So you create an optimization backlog at the end of each wave with owners and dates, right sizing, reserved capacity decisions, logging noise reduction, and technical debt you intentionally carried during rehost. If nobody owns it, it will rot in production forever. And here's the trap to avoid. Don't let the factory become an approval board. That's not scale. That's bureaucracy. The factory exists to produce paved roads, self-service subscription vending, pre-wired monitoring, default network integration, and enforcement through policy. Teams should be able to onboard without begging, but they should be unable to bypass guardrails without leaving evidence. That's the balance. Migration at scale is not speed, it's throughput without drift. And if you can't do repeatable validation, you're not scaling migration, you're scaling risk. Phase 3, modernization, managed services, containers, event-driven. Phase 3 is where everyone finally gets what they asked for on day 1, cloud native. And this is where most programs either compound value or light the runway on fire. Because modernization is not an activity, it's a consequence. When phase 1 and phase 2 are real, landing zones enforced, shared services stable, factory validation repeatable, modernization stops being a religious war and becomes a portfolio of deliberate bets. And the bets usually fall into 3 buckets: managed services, containers, and event-driven integration. Start with managed services because that's the most boring kind of modernization. And boring is usually where the ROI hides. Moving a SQL server that nobody wants to patch into a managed database isn't innovative, but it collapses your operational burden. Moving identity, handling out of custom code into standardized identity patterns isn't sexy, but it reduces incident time. Replacing DIY backup scripts with platform-aligned backup and retention patterns isn't a transformation story, but it's the difference between a contained outage and a multi-day recovery. Managed services are modernization that buys back human time, and human time is the scarcest resource in the program. So when you modernize into managed services, you're doing 2 things at once: reducing cost to serve and making risk more predictable. You're removing Snowflake operational work from the workload teams and pushing it into the platform's standard capabilities. That's why phase 3 can only happen after the platform is stable. If the platform isn't stable, managed services don't simplify, they multiply confusion. Teams don't know what's supported, security doesn't know how to monitor it, and operations doesn't know how to recover it. Now containers. Here's the uncomfortable truth. Containerization is not modernization by default, it's packaging. Sometimes it's the right packaging, sometimes it's just a more complicated way to run the same mess. Containers earn their keep when you need repeatable deployments, consistent runtime environments, and scaling patterns that VMs never gave you cleanly. They also earn their keep when you're trying to decouple release velocity from infrastructure change, because when your deployment becomes push a container, infrastructure stops being a negotiation. But containerization becomes a self-inflicted wound when teams use it to avoid making architectural decisions. They take a legacy monolith, put it in a container, drop it onto an orchestrator, and then act surprised when nothing got easier. The same coupling exists. The same database is still the choke point. The same brittle integrations still break. The only thing that changed is now you have more layers between you and the failure. So the stance is simple. Use containers where they reduce operational friction, not where they increase it. And be honest about orchestrators. If you're going to run a platform like Kubernetes, you're taking on an operating model, upgrades, patching, cluster hygiene, networking complexity, and security posture that requires maturity. If your organization isn't ready for that, containerization becomes new tech debt with better marketing. Now, event-driven integration. This is the modernization path that actually changes how systems behave, which is why it's also the one that breaks people. Event-driven doesn't mean we use the message queue. It means you stop pretending synchronous coupling is a good default. You stop having systems block on each other's availability. You stop designing your entire enterprise around the idea that everything is online and deterministic all the time. Legacy systems love synchronous coupling because it feels like control. Modern systems survive through decoupling because reality isn't controllable. Event-driven patterns reduce blast radius. They make change safer. They make integrations more tolerant of failure. They also make incident response more complex if your observability is weak, which is why, again, phase 3 is a privilege you earn after phase 1 and phase 2 are stable. Because once events start flowing, you need the ability to answer what happened across multiple services, multiple subscriptions, and multiple teams without turning the investigation into a week-long archaeology dig. Now, data modernization is where a lot of migration programs quietly bleed out because everybody underestimates it. Large transfers aren't hard because the bytes are big. They're hard because the validation is brutal. You can move terabytes, even petabytes, but the business doesn't care that you move data. The business cares that it's complete, accurate, and usable. That means orchestration, reconciliation, and discipline. Tools exist for bulk transfer when bandwidth is the constraint, and orchestration exists when coordination is the constraint. But the principle doesn't change. You validate before, during, and after. And you don't declare victory because the copy finished. You declare victory when downstream consumers behave as expected. Now connect this back to the strategic insight because this is the part that keeps the program from self-destructing. Modernization is a lagging indicator of platform maturity. If your platform contract is enforced, modernization compounds. Patterns get reused, teams onboard faster, controls remain consistent, cost variance drops because you standardize what good looks like. If your platform contract is weak, modernization becomes probabilistic. Every team builds a different pattern, exceptions proliferate, and cloud native becomes a synonym for we don't know what this will cost or how it will fail. So phase 3 is not now we refactor everything. Phase 3 is selective modernization, where the platform can carry it and where the business case is explicit. You modernize the workloads that are differentiators. You replatform the workloads that benefit from managed services. You keep rehosting where stability is the priority, and you delete what should never have existed. And if you do it in that order, modernization stops being a risky leap. It becomes the payoff for doing the boring parts correctly. Failure story, the premature refactor that stalled the program. A financial services firm kicked off their cloud program with the most common executive mandate. We're going cloud native. No lift and shift. We're not paying twice. Refactor everything. Leadership intent sounded rational. They wanted modernization benefits immediately. They wanted to avoid carrying legacy debt into Azure. They wanted the story to be clean. One move, one transformation, no half measures. What actually happened was a slow motion stall. The first few workloads didn't move. They entered discovery. Then discovery turned into architecture reviews. Then architecture reviews turned into standards debates. Then those debates turned into new platform requirements. New ingress patterns, new identity flows, new logging format, new container strategy, new data model rules, all at once. Meanwhile, the platform team hadn't finished the landing zone contract. Networking was still in flux, policies were still being negotiated, observability wasn't standardized, subscription vending wasn't real. So every cloud-native decision required a new exception. And exceptions aren't acceleration, they're debt. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The invisible constraint they ignored was platform immaturity. When your platform can't enforce consistent identity, network paths, policy, and observability, refactoring becomes probabilistic. The same refactor looks different in every team's hands. The same security requirement produces different access models. The same deployment objective produces different pipelines. You get fragmentation disguised as innovation. The program also discovered another constraint executives hate. Refactoring consumes your best people first. The engineers who could have built repeatable patterns were stuck rewriting one application's internals. Operations couldn't stabilize because nothing was landing consistently. Security couldn't standardize monitoring because every workload looked different. And because nothing shipped, leadership started asking for more velocity, which translated into more parallel work streams, which translated into more drift. Then the business got impatient. They still had data center deadlines. They still had vendor support timelines. They still had hardware renewals. So they pivoted. Fine, just lift and shift the easy stuff. Now they had the worst of both worlds, half-built refactors, a rushed rehost wave, and a platform contract that never fully hardened because it kept getting overridden by urgency. The principle that would have prevented it is boring and absolute: sequence modernization after stability. Rehost or replatform to build throughput, prove guardrails, and stabilize operating patterns. Then refactor selectively where the business case is real and the platform can carry it. Modernization is a lagging indicator of platform maturity. If you force it early, you don't modernize faster. You just fail in more expensive ways. And that leads to the part most people try to avoid because it implicates everyone in the room. Cloud migration doesn't fail in Terraform. It fails in org charts. Organizational reality. This fails in org charts, not Terraform. The foundational mistake in most enterprise migrations is assuming the hard part is technical execution. It isn't. The hard part is that Azure forces an operating model, whether you design one or not. If you don't design it, you still get one. It's just accidental. That's what cloud sprawl actually is. Accidental organizational design expressed as subscriptions, role assignments, exceptions, and half-owned services. Over time, it becomes permanent because nobody can unwind it without breaking something. So let's talk about the real system. Platform teams versus product teams. A platform team owns the contract, landing zones, identity boundaries, network, policy, logging, and the paved roads that let delivery teams move without negotiating every constraint. They build the control plane behavior of the enterprise. Product teams own workloads, features, business outcomes, and the operational responsibility for their service inside the boundaries the platform provides. When that boundary is unclear, everything degrades. Platform teams become ticket queues, product teams become policy negotiators, and governance turns into conditional chaos. This is why a lot of cloud centers of excellence fail. Leadership intends, centralize expertise, reduce risk, standardize patterns. What actually happens is the CCOE becomes an approval board. They review every request, they gate every deployment, they become the human API for cloud access. That feels safe for about 3 weeks until delivery pressure rises. Then teams route around them. They create shadow subscriptions. They deploy outside guardrails. They do whatever they need to ship because the business rewards outcomes, not compliance narratives. And once that bypass exists, it becomes your real operating model. You can't govern what you can't see. So a good CCOE, if you insist on having one, is not a gatekeeper. It is a platform product team with a backlog, service level objectives, and automation as the default interface. It produces paved roads, self-service subscription vending, enforced policy baselines, standard logging, standard network integration, and identity patterns that don't require negotiation. It doesn't approve work. It designs the system so safe work is the easiest work. That distinction matters. Now, FinOps. Most executives hear FinOps and think it means save money. That framing is childish. FinOps is a governance muscle. It's the mechanism that turns cloud economics from surprise invoices into predictable unit economics. It's how you measure cost to serve, not just raw spend. Cost to serve is the metric that actually matters in enterprise migrations. What does it cost to run this workload reliably, securely, and compliantly per transaction, per customer, per policy, per claim, per plant, per whatever your business sells? If you don't track that, you can't tell whether modernization is working. You can only tell whether the bill went up. And the bill always goes up early if you're doing anything real. So FinOps has to sit inside governance, not outside it. It needs tagging standards that are enforced, not suggested. It needs budgets and anomaly detection that actually land with the people who can act. It needs consistent subscription boundaries so you can compare workloads fairly. And it needs executives who understand that predictability beats savings theater. Now let's deal with the talent lie. Most organizations try to solve cloud migrations with hero teams, 1 or 2 experts, a tiger team, a partner group, a central platform crew that handles Azure. That model fails because it doesn't scale. Cloud skills have to distribute, patterns have to standardize, cognitive load has to drop. Because your migration throughput is not a function of how good your best engineer is, it's a function of how safe your average team can be with the defaults. That's what landing zones and paved roads actually buy you, the ability for non-hero teams to ship safely inside guardrails. And this is why org design matters so much. If your operating model rewards speed over compliance, you will get bypasses. If your platform team is underfunded, product teams will invent their own platforms. If your identity team treats exceptions as customer service, you will get parallel auth paths. And if leadership measures apps migrated instead of time to market, stability, cost to serve predictability, and organizational throughput, you will get motion without progress. The uncomfortable truth is that Azure doesn't break the business. Your organization breaks itself against Azure because the old habits don't map cleanly. So if you want migration success, you don't start with a tool chain. You start with a durable division of responsibilities, platform as contract, product as execution, governance as enforced intent. Everything else is just the platform reflecting your org chart back at you, and it will not flatter you. Failure story. The CCOE that became a gatekeeper. A large financial services organization stood up a cloud center of excellence with the best possible intentions. Leadership intent was clean. Centralize expertise. Reduce risk. Stop teams from doing random things in Azure. Make it safe. So they staffed the CCOE with smart people, architects, security leads, a few engineers who had survived prior migrations. They wrote standards, they created templates, they built a review process. What actually happened was predictable. The CCOE became the human control plane. Every subscription request became a ticket. Every network change became a meeting. Every exception became a negotiation. And because the CCOE owned cloud, product teams stopped owning outcomes. They started owning escalation paths. The backlog didn't just grow, it metastasized because demand scales faster than centralized approvals. Then came the first real delivery deadline, a regulatory change, a customer-facing feature, something the business actually cared about. Teams did what teams always do when they're blocked by a centralized gate. They went around it. A temporary subscription appeared under the root management group because someone had permissions they shouldn't have. A temporary service principal got owner because it was faster than waiting for PIM and access reviews. A temporary firewall exception got added because the hub team couldn't get to the request this week. And now the organization had 2 clouds, the governed one in the landing zone and the real one where delivery happened. Nothing broke technically, everything broke systemically. The invisible constraint they ignored was simple. Centralized approvals don't scale, and they create a market for ungoverned workarounds. The CCOE didn't reduce risk, it concentrated decision-making until teams had to bypass it to ship. That bypass became the default behavior. And because it wasn't designed, it wasn't observable. Security couldn't monitor consistently. Finance couldn't forecast reliably. Audit couldn't explain the control narrative without apologizing. Then the CCOE reacted the way approval boards always react. More forms, more gates, more documentation, more friction, which increased bypass behavior. That loop feeds itself. The principle that would have prevented it is the same one Azure landing zones were built for in the first place. Paved roads. Self-service but constrained. automation, but enforced. Subscription vending that creates the right management group placement, the right RBAC, the right policy inheritance, the right logging, and the right network integration by default. And a rule that's uncomfortable but necessary. If a team can't get what they need through the paved road, the road is wrong. Fix the road. Don't hand them a machete. The CCOE shouldn't be a gatekeeper. It should be a platform product team. A team with a backlog, clear service boundaries, and an explicit contract. Here's what you get by default. Here's how you request change. Here's how exceptions expire. Here's how we measure success. Because the only scalable governance model is the one where the safest path is also the easiest path. Everything else is conditional chaos with a ticket number. Closing synthesis, the enterprise migration mindset. Most organizations want a migration plan. What they actually need is a migration mindset, because migration is not a date you announce. It's not a checklist you complete. It's not a tooling decision you delegate. Migration is an operating model shift. It is a trust contract between central IT and delivery teams. Central teams stop doing ad hoc approvals and instead enforce intent through design. Delivery teams stop improvising infrastructure and instead consume paved roads that make safe work routine. That distinction matters. If leadership frames migration as move workloads to Azure, the program will measure activity, how many apps moved, how many servers shut down, how many subscriptions exist, and then the business will still be surprised. Surprised by audit findings, surprised by incidents, surprised by cost variance, surprised by the fact that cloud didn't magically create agility. Because cloud doesn't create agility, governed systems create agility. So the mindset is simple and brutal. Platform first, then factory, then modernization. You build the landing zone contract so intent is enforceable at scale. You build the migration factory so delivery is repeatable and validated, not heroic. And only then do you modernize, selectively, where the platform can carry it and the business case is real. Along the way, you stop pretending every workload deserves investment. Some deserve replatforming because it buys operational leverage. Some deserve rehosting because stability matters more than ideology. Some deserve refactoring because they're differentiators. And some deserve deletion because your migration capacity is finite and entropy is expensive. And you track outcomes like an adult. Time to market, how long from idea to production, risk and stability. Do incidents decrease and does recovery get faster? Cost to serve predictability. Can you forecast spend by workload or does it surprise you? Organizational throughput. How many teams can move safely in parallel without governance collapsing? Cloud migrations are justified by outcomes, not architectures. That's the executive framing that survives budget reviews, leadership churn, and audit season. And this is the final thought that leaders need to internalize before they sign another migration mandate. The goal isn't to get to Azure. The goal is to build an enterprise that can change faster than its market. Treat migration as enterprise transformation. Platform first, then a migration factory, then modernization when maturity earns it. If you want the next layer, watch the episode on landing zone governance, drift, and policy entropy, and subscribe, because without enforcement, your cloud strategy decays into exceptions faster than you think.